Sometimes, sometimes in school there are assignments that stay with you. And I remember distinctly a class in seminary that talked about what are the classics, what are the key texts of Unitarian Universalism and the free church tradition that we as soon-to-be ministers needed to know. And I did my final paper arguing that The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva should be included in Unitarian Universalists' tradition. Even though it is not really our tradition, but I think it holds a lot. The video we're about to see is a little bit of a more concise, better introduction, I think, than I can give on who Shantideva was and why he's important. So it's pretty basic, but and it involves a little bit of reading, but I think it'll be pretty informative. So I give you a short biography of Shantideva. This morning I want to do something rather ambitious. Today I want to speak of this particular moment in history. How well do we serve the vision and demands of Unitarian Universalism in this time and place that we find ourselves? Because every generation is called to respond to the challenges of history and to articulate again what Unitarian Universalism is for their particular era. I believe we find ourselves finally at a moment in the life of our country in which our particular and perhaps peculiar faith of Unitarian Universalism is uniquely called. I think we have a moment to make a lasting and substantial contribution to the American conversation of religion in our democracy. But before we get to those lofty heights, let me take you to dinner. Not today, not right now, but rather invite you to a dinner that did not in fact happen. This was a meal that was to have taken place many years ago when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. It is about a dinner that was sabotaged. I know, because I am the one who sabotaged it. It was my senior year, and I was staying with a group of guys, good friends of mine, actually, who were all first-generation immigrants from Vietnam. A whole wave of immigrants from Vietnam came to this country at the end of the war in the 1970s, and I guess it dates me a little bit to tell you that the children of those immigrants who made that harrowing journey are my age. And through a friend of a friend in high school, I came to be connected to this group of Vietnamese American guys. And we all became good friends. And when I left the dorms, I knew exactly who I'd be living with. Well, at any rate, there was this bunch of us guys living off campus in our own apartment, and you can imagine how well we kept up the place. Someone once said that college guys living together without adult supervision is a little bit like bears with furniture, you know. That was kind of the state of our apartment at the time. One day I came home from class and smelled something terrible. Actually, I'd never smelled anything so bad like it before. It was powerful, it was rotting, and it was coming from our kitchen. Sure enough, there was a pot sitting on the stove, and there was no heat under this pot. Someone had meant to put it into the refrigerator, had left it out, and it had clearly gone bad. I opened this pot to see a kind of slimy, somewhat congealed liquid with dark eggs and vegetables in it I didn't recognize. As soon as I lifted the lid, I quickly realized this was the source of the smell that had greeted me at the door. I threw it into the garbage, and then when the smell lingered, I bagged up the garbage and sent that down the chute. But it was a small drop in the bucket of keeping our apartment clean. I felt like I had achieved something Herculean in that moment. That is until my roommate Lum came home a bit later in the afternoon. He was looking around in the kitchen. He asked me if I had seen a pot on the stove. I said, well, yes, I had. I told him about how bad it had smelled and that I had thrown it out. And that is when I learned of the dinner that I had sabotaged. For you see, Lum had been home the previous weekend, and his mother had sent back with him to college a pot of one of his family's most beloved delicacies from Vietnam. It was comfort food made with love from his mother, and I had pitched it in the trash before he had had the opportunity to eat any of it. Well, I'm sure you can imagine that I felt about what was going through my head in the moment. I felt about 2 inches tall at the time. Obviously, I profusely apologized. Lum was not as forgiving as I had expected him to be. We were very close friends at the time, and he really had been looking forward to that meal. It took at least 2 weeks of me apologizing, friends intervening on my behalf, and his mother making him another pot of that stew before we were back on good terms. As I think of it now, I think that was my first lesson in what we now call decentering. And while this Vietnamese delicacy didn't exactly smell like my grandmother's chicken and dumpling soup, it was equally beloved. Both dishes embody the spirit of love and affection from one generation passed down to the other in edible form. Subconsciously, I assumed that comfort food from home looked and smelled a certain way. Lum, and by extension his mother, taught me that that isn't necessarily so. There are a lot of ways to get to the same outcome, some of which I had never considered before. Not because they're bad, I just hadn't been exposed to something like Lum's mom's stew in a small town in white middle-class Michigan. Indeed, when we think about our culture and the changing face of American society, we come to see that diversity is now a given and not a conclusion. Since those college days, I've lived in some of the most diverse places in America, with white, African American, Latino, Vietnamese, African, First Nation, and lots of other people of color inhabiting the same city. To just choose one of those groups and proclaim their perspective on the world and their experience of their faith to be definitive, well, that's a little like saying that only chicken and dumpling soup is the only kind of comfort food allowed. And that just isn't true. In our reading a moment ago, we heard from the Buddhist philosopher and ethicist Shantideva. According to the Dalai Lama, Shantideva's The Way of the Bodhisattva has perhaps been the most influential text on his life and his religious leadership of nonviolence. And although Shantideva himself lived in India, his work is usually studied primarily within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And as we saw from the video, legend has it that as Shantideva was preaching the final section, the most sublime teaching of the Way of the Bodhisattva, he began to ascend into the sky, sort of like Elijah. And that the final chapter, the ultimate teaching he'd been leading up to, is actually preached from the Tushita heaven, the highest heaven in the Buddhist Hindu pantheon. Never fear, however, I have tested this pulpit, and if it happens to me, I think I can hold on lest I start to levitate here this morning. Well, what is this sort of subtle and revered teaching? A full analysis of Shantideva is perhaps beyond us this morning, but suffice it for our purposes today, I would summarize it this way: that in order to have an experience of oneness, of interconnection with that interdependent web of which we are all a part, we should exchange ourselves for another. Imagine, as best we can, life from another person's perspective. We should decenter, if we want to use that term, our personal experience of the world and make room for considering life from someone else's point of view. Now, of course, I should not arrogantly believe that I know exactly what it's like to be a person of color or a transgender person rather than a cisgendered person, but such musings are more of my imagination than they are lived experience. However, the attempt, the spiritual practice, if you will, is to be open to those other experiences, to at least acknowledge that the world can be seen in new and different ways, in a small step, I think, towards that interconnected world we seek. My friends, the nation in which we live is fractured. In fact, our world left fractured behind a long time ago and has instead moved into balkanized silos which resist change and alternative points of view. So much so that imagination is confused with fact for the sake of political expediency. Differences in race and politics and gender and other identities are elevated to heights they were never meant to go. So much so that our differences seem to define us more so than our commonalities do. And we see the gulf between ourselves and others as these existential divides that no amount of compromise or empathy seems to be able to bridge. We've seen, even in the last few years, similar divisions creeping into our beloved Unitarian Universalism, whether it's debates regarding anti-racism, white supremacy, trans identity, or the gadflies that oppose them. These discussions exacerbate our divisions. Now, at a certain level, that can be a good thing. It's sort of our denomination's reckoning, if you will, that we've centered the experience of straight white men, mostly from New England. Now, those are not bad people, and I feel a great deal of gratitude toward our religious ancestors for crafting the free church tradition of their day into the Unitarian Universalism that is our collective birthright. However, we're now in a process of coming to the understanding that theirs isn't the only way to understand our tradition. For too long, we've been throwing away the pot of stew on the stove because it smelled odd to us without reflecting that it too could be comfort food. We have divergent voices within our tradition now, differences of thought, differences around which one of our values is most important, differences of where our faith should go into the future and its role in that future. And there are no easy answers. The path forward can get murky, but it's always been murky. Never in our history have we ever had consensus on these sorts of matters. It just looks like that through the history books that we read looking backwards. In real life, Unitarians and Universalists have always fought and argued amongst themselves, and then when they merged, ironically, they fought and argued with each other as Unitarian Universalists. It's our tradition, though, to stay in covenant while we try to figure out this messy stuff. The rest of the nation needs to learn this as well. That's the central idea, I think, that we have that the world needs: covenant. Creeds, you may recall, are statements of belief that ensure that people in church remain in relationship to each other. If you can't agree on those beliefs that's articulated in that creed, then you're out. Relationship's over. You're denounced as a heretic. But the free church tradition, to which we are the heirs, flipped it. It teaches it's the relationship that's more important than our beliefs. And we can have different beliefs, but we must stay connected to each other through this mutually agreed upon covenant. And it's this notion of covenant that stands in the center and holds us together as we have these hard, messy, sloppy, emotional, urgent conversations about who we are and how we move forward together. Covenant not only stands at the center, but also helps us to understand who we are by defining the edges. It's the thing that connects us despite our deep differences, keeps us at the table as we try to truly listen to the other and imagine their worldview and experience as best we can, knowing that our imagination is inherently imperfect. Unlike creeds, which hold the center by dominating the conversation and making all perspectives the same, a covenant is a touchstone that we remember as we test the limits of the container. We disagree, but still love each other. One of the ways we articulate this covenant to ourselves as a larger Unitarian Universalist faith is through our principles and purposes. They start out saying this quite explicitly. The line is, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote," and then it goes through the list. So that when we consider adding an eighth principle, what we're really considering is a change to that covenant. Anti-racism is both a description of who we are and of what we value, while at the same time being aspirational, putting a vision out there of what we want to see happen in our church and in our nation. The covenant of our principles is for us to understand our faith, but it's also for the world, so that they can see and hear our vision too. That is our great teaching to the world, to our broken, fractured nation. That in disagreement there can still be love. There is still relationship. There is difference and there is interconnection. In fact, no one says it better, really, than our friend Shantideva. The passage that Anne read for us as our reading this morning's quite often cited. Shantideva, we might think of him as kind of a prophet for the seventh principle of interconnection. And in a section that's kind of reminiscent almost of Paul's letters to the Corinthians, Shantideva writes, although there are many different parts and aspects, such as the hands, as a body that is to be protected, they are one. Likewise, all the different sentient beings in their pleasure and in their pain have a wish to be happy that is the same as mine. When both myself and others are similar in that we wish to be happy, what's so special about me? Why do I strive for my happiness alone when both myself and others are similar in that we do not wish to suffer? What's so special about me? Why do I protect myself and not them? The hand protects the foot. Because without even thinking of it, it knows it's interconnected. The fate of the hand is going to be the same as the fate of the foot if one of them gets a big ego all of a sudden and says, and the body is critically wounded, then they both will die. This insight into our basic dependence on each other within Unitarian Universalism and within America as a whole is the foundation of our faith. We are interconnected, and that understanding needs to pervade our consciousness. We must remember it all the time, even, and I dare say especially, when we're in the midst of one of our fights, our disagreements, our squabbles, our kerfuffles, or however you describe the right and necessary sloppy process of living out our faith in the most authentic way possible. I might even go so far as to say, the sloppier, the better. Why hold back? If Emerson were here, he would tell us to be who we are no matter what that happens to be. Sure, Emerson could be a jerk, but he was an honest jerk. We need to engage our authentic selves together, remembering that what holds us in that covenant are sacred interconnections that can never be broken, no matter what we say or think. The foot and the hand are different, but recognize their basic interrelated nature. Lum's stew and my grandmother's soup are different, but they have the same effect of expressing love and connecting us to our family and to our childhood. They are equally good and equally valid. Both perspectives are important, and both sides can be true. That is how we should strive to live out this messy, somewhat sloppy conversation of competing values and worldviews we call Unitarian Universalism, because that diversity can only help us speak more cogently to a much more diverse nation. My dear friends, I urge you today at our congregational meeting to vote to affirm the eighth principle, to the end that all souls may be united in our common covenant of love and justice, and that no one's soup is ever thrown away, but warmed up and eaten with hearty gusto. I love you. Go in peace. Amen.